Very good. But I will try to combine both perspectives. I will try to talk a little bit about what we've learned as analysts and researchers and observers of clusters and cluster practice, cluster-based economic development, but hopefully think about what that means for practice and what that means for the role that you all play in economic development for these regions, for the companies that you work with. Now, I'm very honored to be here in Catalonia. As Alberto talked about, there's a lot of history here between TCI, between cluster practice, and this region. TCI was founded here. A lot of the key thinkers and drivers and entrepreneurs in this field come from Barcelona and this region. And so it's always like coming back home when we're coming here. So it's not by accident that the TCI Secretariat is located here and is in fact located in this building. But I want to be also very clear that it's not just kind of a historical affinity and the past that makes this attractive to be here. Because I think this region and many of you in this room are also contributing to the future of this field. We talked this morning in a number of discussions about what is happening in Catalonia, and I think you have constantly innovated and came up with new ways to interpret clusters as a practical process. You did internationalization in a structured way before it became fashionable in Europe. You started, you know, the theme of today, intercluster. You started to talk about how cluster organizations and clusters can collaborate with each other way before the European Commission kind of jumped on the bandwagon and said now it's all cross clusters. So I think there is a lot of new ideas that come from this region and from the practice as these regions that for the rest of us I think is very important to engage with and learn from. But learning only happens if there's also a willingness to share and engage. And I really want to kind of acknowledge the role that that you, Alberto, Juan, you know, Enrique, and many others here in the room have been playing, because you have not just done good things here in the region, but you were always willing and are always willing to go out and talk to others about what you do and learn from it, and share both the success and the failures. I think that's exactly the type of leadership that we need to move this field forward in our practice forward. So thank you very much for that, and I hope we will continue this journey learning together. Now I want to think a little bit about these questions here. I want to look back a little bit on what we've done over the last couple of years in terms of research and how that affected our thinking. First on the role of clusters as an economic phenomena. And I want to focus especially on the notion of change. Because quite often when we, as analysts, look at clusters, we almost looked at it as one point in time. We try to understand what makes a good cluster, a dynamic cluster, a world-class cluster. But I think we maybe underemphasized that clusters is kind of really a moving target. It's a way to understand evolution and change. And from what I saw in the Twitter kind of feed for this morning, this is exactly what you talked about. You know, how are new technologies and new type of things in your markets changing firms, and then also changing clusters. So I'll talk a little bit about the little we know, I would say, about evolution, about how clusters change, and about how new clusters emerge. The second part of my talk will then focus more on cluster-based economic development. And here, I think we've learned much more over the last decade of how you can translate this recognition that regional economies are economies of clusters, specialized in certain fields, into how governments can leverage these type of structures. Now, when we would have had this discussion 10 years ago, I think it would have been about, you know, how do we create clusters, and is that the right way to think about it? I think we've moved on over the last couple of years, and what now is really the focus, I think, is how do we organize cluster-based efforts. So it's not so much whether or not this is in principle a good idea, but it's how do you do this in practice, because we've seen a lot of heterogeneous models develop in different parts of the world, and some work better than others, and this is really where we need to focus on, the science of practice almost, of cluster-based economic development. And I'll try to then at the end, you know, draw some lessons, emerging lessons maybe, that hopefully are somewhat useful as you think about your role as cluster managers or your role as companies and executives that work in cluster organizations. What are the core building blocks of the framework that have evolved and that I think still matter? And I want to talk about this because I do think it's quite important that we understand what has changed and we understand what really defines what clusters are about. Related variety. So clusters are not about being very good and specialized in a very narrow activity and just do a lot of it, kind of economies of scale. There's one city in China that produces 80% of all buttons for the world or something like that. Yes, that's also important. But clusters are really about connecting the different pieces of a puzzle that together create value. And that's the key challenge, I think, the moving target for you as cluster managers to always see, so what are these pieces that I need to bring together? With digitalization, what are the new types of capabilities and firms that all of a sudden might become relevant for my firm that I need to connect with and find a common language is? It is really this related variety. It's not specialization in something narrow, but it's also not, as some others might sometimes argue, no, it's all about heterogeneous. We just need to be different. That's true. I can learn from people that are different from me, but there needs to be a common ground. There needs to be something that we can talk about, that we have to share. And that's really what clusters are about. The second key idea was the one of proximity. And it's not that everything that you do has to be with your close neighbors and the people around you in your region. The argument instead is that what you can do with people that are close by geographically is different from what you can do with people that are in other parts of the world. It's this intense dialogue. It's the exchange of tacit knowledge. It's kind of the density of the collaboration. It's the ability to together create competitive advantages that others can't copy. That is really what sets these local networks apart from the increasing amounts of global linkages that we also have. And so far, we see no evidence that that has gone away. Yes, global linkages are enormously important, and you need to work a lot at that, but they do not play that exact role that your local system can do. So if you have people that have something that they share, they are close by, it's then about bringing them together. And there, I think the clusters brought this idea of collaboration and rivalry, that it's about the type of interaction. So then I put both rivalry and collaboration in there because as cluster practitioners, we always focus on the collaboration part. But it's important to understand it's always this balance of these two factors and kind of managing this productive tension, also between your companies. I mean, hiring the right type of employees, thinking about who the customers are that we can work with. It's this tension that creates the sparks that leads to higher performance. Clusters are not a consortium. They are a different type of animal where these two things coexist. It does coexist if there's critical mass. So if we're just, three fellows or three entities that work together that fall into this category, there's little that we can do. There are not that many interesting connections between the three of us. If we're 25, much more things can happen. So critical mass, it really is conceptually an important point that we see. So if you look at where I was coming from yesterday, from Boston, if you look at the pharmaceutical clusters, you see exactly these at play. You see the local buzz among this group of related and very connected, but also very intensely competing set of industries and entities that work together. But you see also that this is connected within a very global industry in pharmaceuticals, where Boston plays one role, but there are many other locations that play many other roles. And where exactly each location stands, that's always open up to competition. But you see kind of this combination of local buzz and global pipelines playing out. Now, the data also can then be used to really much more systematically than we were able before to track impact. So if there is such a strong cluster, what does that mean for companies? What does that mean for the region today? And what does it mean for the region tomorrow? And we do see very clearly that clusters provide a context in which firms can make their strategic choices. They still have a choice, so it's not deterministic that just because you're in a cluster you will always make better choices or be a better company. But it provides you a different environment in which you make your choices. And I think we saw that very clearly during the crisis. A lot of critics of clusters had said, oh, you know, clusters might be good for productivity, but it's putting your eggs all in one basket. And if a crisis hits, you know, you'll be sorry that you focused. The reality in the data was actually quite different. What we saw is the regions that had clusters were much better able, the companies were much better able to together figure out new ways to apply their capabilities, identify new markets, kind of readjust. The people that were hardest hit were the companies that were alone, that kind of didn't know what to do once their market declined. So it is an opportunity that you give your companies, but of course it's them that then make the choices about strategy. We see much more kind of the link between performance in terms of wages, prosperity, innovation, and so on, between cluster strength and these type of outcomes, so there's a lot of literature on that. Interestingly, also on entrepreneurship. And this is something we might come back to when we talk about policy. I think we often think about clusters as one thing and entrepreneurship as a different set of programs and a pillar of government policy. In the data, it turns out that within strong clusters, there is a higher propensity for entry, which kind of makes sense because we have a lot of people that know the industry and that can spot opportunities and maybe start something and also find the suppliers to turn an idea into something real. But we also see higher levels of survival and higher rates of growth of companies that go into these clusters. So rather than to see these as different, I think it's much better to see them as an integral part of what's going on. And finally, we see that the way that structures in an economy is changing. So if you look at Catalonia and Barcelona, how it changed from very manufacturing-oriented towards much more service-driven in its industrial composition, this process happens through a process of related diversification. So you move from one cluster into another cluster where you can use a little bit of the things that you've done in the past, but add some new things that you're learning or have learned in the path as moving forward. Now, if you then look at it from a regional perspective, I think what we've increasingly learned is that change happens through this process of related diversification. So the basic idea is that each of these bubbles is a group of related industries in a cluster, medical devices, agro machinery, or so on. But it's also connected with a lot of others because firms do not categorize themselves by cluster. I mean, they say, I have a product, I have a capability, I have something attractive, and I might sell it to many different industries. And so I think we've gotten better at understanding these linkages. And the argument is that as you emerge as a region, you know, you move from one strength that you might have in one cluster, and you often transfer that then to others. This is the way that regions evolve. They have this systematic evolution into other sectors. And there are different approaches in the academic community at the moment, but I think they all share this idea that there is related diversification. Now, to try to put cluster-based economic development on the map, I want to contrast it a little bit with other types of approaches. What do governments do to help regions and companies succeed? So there's one kind of family of efforts that is very firm or sector-focused. So it works with individual sectors, it works with individual companies. Economic gardening is essentially consulting firm by firm, helping them to become more efficient, picking winners. You know, we put all the money behind some industries that we're good at. The next big thing, we're putting the money not behind winners that we already have, but behind winners that we think will emerge in the future generally. And then, of course, there's big game hunting, the kind of FDI attraction type of approach. So all very focused on picking individual firms or industries. The alternative is to say, no, we don't work with specific industries or firms. We do something for the business environment. And so the OECD talks a lot about framework conditions. Do something for schools, infrastructure, innovation system, all this kind of stuff. In the US, they like this open for business. That's kind of the Texas model, as little government as possible. All the rest the market will solve, but you know, be attractive because it's easy to do business. A new theme that I think gets a lot of traction is kind of this placemaking. Be a nice place. Be open to different people, kind of Richard Florida and others, you know, create places where people can meet, all of that. And then you also see this kind of build it and they will come. You know, let's do a big infrastructure thing, or build a university, do the Olympics, which Barcelona did very successfully. So it's kind of more on these, again, from very broad to very narrow and focused ones. I would say clusters and also the focus on entrepreneurial ecosystem is kind of in the middle, because it argues that ultimately, in order to have more competitive firms, you need to change the business environment. You need to create assets that companies can compete on. But if you want to do that, you have to be somewhat firm and sector specific. You need to understand the demands that exist in individual clusters rather than across the entire economy. And this is largely a reaction to, I think, what we've seen is the outcome. So economic gardening is nice, but you know, you can't work with all the 10,000 companies that you have in Catalonia. These efforts on business environment, they're all good and they should be done, but they're often not creating specific competitive advantages. You know, I mean, how many ads have you seen in the paper of European regions that say, we are open, we are centrally located, and all these kind of general things? Infrastructure, this kind of one big thing, is very high risk because government just doesn't know what the value of those types will be. That's also true for these kind of traditional sectoral policies, but in addition, they are often very open to kind of political economy effects. So, you know, there's all this capturing going on. So the idea is that clusters and entrepreneurial ecosystems are a way to do this type of economic development policy that is more specific, can create competitive advantages, but is not subject to these classical kind of government failure type of challenges in the same way that industrial policy is. But then the question is, how do we get it right? How do we do it? So what we've seen is that what has emerged is cluster policies that span a wide range of different types of things. So some cluster policies are used to motivate very firm-specific interventions. You know, okay, we want to build a biotech industry, so let's pay subsidies to firms to come. Let's attract the firms only in these sectors. Let's give directed credit. Others intervene in the market. You know, if you look at the solar industry in Germany, I think part of that was really, you know, we create a lot of demand. We're agnostic about technology, but we're creating a lot of demand, and that kind of focuses on the development of this cluster. Sometimes you might create monopoly rights, you know, have little international competition. To the right here, you see the more long-term investments. And one, I think, is really create business environment conditions, provide the right kind of skills, infrastructure, dedicated research capabilities, and so on in a sector that helps. And then, of course, also enable collaboration within the cluster. So, you know, it's with the red and green, you already see kind of where we're leaning in terms of what we think about the effectiveness. But the political struggle, I think, that we see is that these things are very powerful short-term. They might be actually negative in the long term, but in the short term, they're damned effective to put a subsidy on the table. These things we feel and see in the data has much more potential long term, but it's not fixing the short term challenges that your bosses and the politicians are often facing that say, we need 5,000 new jobs. Please deliver them from your cluster organization. So that's the reality that we're facing. If this is the way to think about this, clusters become more an organizing principle rather than a different intervention. So do entrepreneurship, do workforce training, do science and technology with the cluster lens. What is it that we can do differently by organizing our existing activities in internationalization and so on through cluster-based approaches? The reality is often that clusters are instead another silo, another department, another organizational responsibility, and not a way that things are done in these existing efforts. Now we're here meeting with a lot of cluster managers, and of course cluster initiatives and these intermediaries have become a key instrument in enabling collaboration, but also organizing government policy around this. What have we learned about what makes these initiatives successful? And you know, we counted more than 2,000 in Europe, and I'm sure that's undercounting. I'm sure there are many more cluster organizations. that are there, and some are great, and some are not so good. So what drives their success? Well, first it might be that it's because of what they do. And I remember that when we first looked at cluster initiatives, we thought maybe there's some killer app, something that every cluster initiative ought to do, and then it's going to be successful and really deliver value for its companies. The data suggests that that's not the case. The data suggests that what is important is that what you do is aligned with the unique needs of your companies. And that's almost trivial. Of course that's the case. But the reality is that our government programs always set these priorities and say, now everybody needs to do this or that. That's a priority for every cluster organization. So it's easy to say, it's not quite so easy in practice to follow this rule. Then we've also seen that the context is quite important. So how strong is the cluster, or how strong is the business environment? And I think that is critical because of evaluation. So, everybody hears that we need to evaluate the impact of cluster organizations. I agree with that. I think we need that also as a management information tool. But we need to also realize that the economic outcomes of what you do in your cluster initiatives is a combination of your efforts and the quality of what you do and the general environment in which you apply them. How good the companies are, what the market environment is, what other tools are. And controlling for this stuff is very hard. And that makes evaluation often very difficult. Because kind of really pinning down what's the delta that comes because of your effort is very difficult. Finally, it's also important how you organize cluster initiative and how you resource and staff them. And for a long time, we talked about the critical importance of cluster initiative managers, their ability to really connect these different worlds, research, government agencies and firms, bringing all this together. What we see is that the demands on cluster initiatives are growing. You're supposed to do more and more things. You have to realize that that means the demands on the capabilities of the cluster initiative managers are also broadening and broadening. And we need to align these two things, otherwise it's not going to work. We need to figure out how this is balancing. What I've seen is that has resulted in kind of two different models. One is what I here call a narrow model, which basically says, we put a little bit of money in these cluster organizations, half a person, maybe a person, and it's really about enabling networking. Your job is to kind of knock the doors of these companies, bring them together, hope that through more linkages, good things will happen. And usually some good things happen, but I think one also has to realize that, output is a function of input. If you don't put in a lot, there's also not that much that's going to happen. Clusters are not a magic solution, and just putting people in one room, even if they hit it off, is not going to change their reality fundamentally. So another model that we see in some places, but in not that many ones, is where they really take a much more systemic approach and say, no, the cluster initiatives become kind of the guiding principle for how we allocate our science and technology funding, how we organize our internationalization, and we that way also bring in the heavy hitters from companies. So companies start to make their investments with a view on where are things happening that the government is doing. So that's much more higher investment, higher outcome, but also higher risk. Because now it really matters. Now these choices are difficult ones and high-stake ones. So it's not necessarily that one is better than the other, but I think we have to realize what world we're in. So where will we stand? This was kind of the thinking on what we observed. I think what we've seen in terms of cluster policies is really that it moved into the mainstream, that it's not experimental anymore, it's not kind of something that's on the sides, it's meaningful in terms of spending. It is largely in areas where we have recognizable local strength. So this old idea that everything was going to go to these pipe dreams and everybody was going to build a biotech cluster without having any assets, that does exist, but I think that's not the majority of the experience. One problem that we have seen emerge, I don't think that's necessarily the key issue here, but we often have many different agencies and ministries that run their own cluster program. And so that's pretty confusing for the companies that have to deal with them, and probably not the most efficient way to organize it. Many countries have that. I do see a very strong focus on strengthening collaboration, but not a broader emphasis on what is needed for competitiveness upgrading. And we see many different models. And I'm trying to, for myself, understand a little bit more how can we categorize what we see in different locations. This is, I understand, still pretty complex. What I've tried to use here is how much are clusters integrated with other policies. So we have some where it's kind of reactive. There are industry groups that come to government and say, please help us design a strategy. We want to write a strategy for our sector and we want to do something. And so there is a kind of a one-off support for that. There are others that say we really need these intermediaries. We understand the importance of collaboration, so we systematically fund these intermediaries. Yet another level adds to that funding and basically says, okay, you not only get funding for building your network, we also make sure that if we give, for example, innovation funding, it's contingent on you coming as a group. You can't get it as an individual research institution or firm. You really need a cluster. And then, the most integrated form, if you will, is really that this is the basic model of how you interact between the public and the private sector. So from sporadic to strategic. And then, of course, the most audacious thing to do is to put names to where we are, and whether or not Catalonia is at the right place here, you have to decide. But at least that's kind of my best guess on these other countries that I know somewhat well, where they stand. And again, it's not from good or from bad to good, from low performance to high performance. It's different models. It's different ambition levels of where you stand. And the reason that I put Catalonia is here is because my sense is that you have created a very effective structure of cluster organizations, but it's not always tied very well with the rest of the instruments for economic development that are being used. So what I talked about here was mainly the German model with the Spitzenclusters, where there was a lot of innovation money, but that instead of giving that to the excellent universities, they said, now you have to come up and build cluster organizations. And that was a learning process for German industry and German academia. It took a couple of years, but I think it has changed the way that they work together. And it has had an impact because it was this combination of lots of money and the focus on collaboration. And down here, I've been working with the Basque government for quite a while, and I think Alberto and I also had this conversation where I was teaching the Basque case to our students at Harvard, and they said, okay, I hear all that, but where's the magic? Because all of the things that you say they do are quite standard. It's not that their skill upgrading program is any different from what I see elsewhere, or the internationalization program is so much different. And my sense was the magic sauce was really that they did all of this through clusters. They had a very effective mechanism of always understanding what the companies needed, but also challenging them and saying, well, we need to get better. What are the next things? So clusters was almost like the pipeline that they used through which they pushed kind of the policy support that was needed and interacted with the governments. I used this slide already at the beginning. I think the use of cluster organizations in the smart specialization strategy comes on the back of a long tradition in Catalonia, positive history and so on. But I also want to at least give you a little bit my sense of where we are. And I wrote here critical assessment. Critical assessment as a friend. So let's start with what's good. I think there's a lot to like. And I talked about some of the things that you've pushed in Catalonia, and I think where you made a contribution to the global practice in the field, really systematically analyzing companies. I think actually in a lot of places we missed that part. I think we only looked at the linkages within our industries. We didn't really focus on the industry analysis, which is classic Porter, but often missed. I think you did a much more on cluster management quality, internationalization, cross-cluster collaboration, other areas. I think also this ideas with kids cluster and so on is very interesting to find new ways of looking at linkages and try to explore that. But the question to me is, have you done the most out of this architectural infrastructure that you've created in Catalonia? Integration with other policies. How far is cluster still one other department rather than a way to do things? And really channel and integrate all the things that the government offers for the companies in your clusters. And there might also be a difference between the reality and the principle. Maybe the reality is much better than the principle organization, because you often, I think, play this role already informally in channel other things. Public-private dialogue. How much is cluster policy here still kind of, a rocket that you send from the government to the companies, pushing through support? Or are you also listening and doing things that then actually feed back into the regional strategy to say, this is what we need, this is how we need to change as government? How can we draw on our analysis of the clusters that we have and their competitive strength to really think about a value proposition for Catalonia? Is that happening? Or do we think about value proposition very much within our own clusters? I wanted to put this in context in kind of 3 key challenges that we identified when we were talking about the smart specialization strategy. And the question was, how can clusters help to address these? The first one was what we call the specialization gap. If you look at the data, the Catalan region is actually not that specialized because you have many clusters that are strong. Partly that's a function of your size, but my sense it was also partly a function of an enormous strategic transformation that has happened in this region. So in the 90s, you were the most industrial part not only of Spain but also of Southern Europe, the Mediterranean region, and with your lower cost levels, you were very attractive for FDI. That's to some degree still the case, but of course you know better than I that what you do in manufacturing has changed a lot, and you have much more services, not only tourism, conferences, but also a lot of other things, science and so on. So it's not as clear anymore as what does Catalonia stand for? What is kind of the key value that we interpret in different ways in our clusters, and how can we deal with that? The company sophistication gap, this kind of very strong foreign direct companies and some large local companies, but largely foreign companies that come here as investors that are very sophisticated. But then the huge number of small companies that you have here that are not at that level. How do you bring those together? And we know for the entire economy to do better, we need to upgrade these small companies in an efficient way. That's clearly something for clusters, but are we playing that role sufficiently? Is there kind of a plan to do that? And then the third one is the innovation gap that I must admit I had no idea how strong Catalonia was in science, because that's not what people recognize. But yeah, you really have built a very impressive science system. The question is, how connected is that to the way that your companies are operating? Now, every region is talking about the difficulty to get academia and companies together, but I think here it's acute because you have such strong science assets now. The question is, how do we translate into something that's economically attractive? Now, that was in 2012. That's a couple of years ago. I didn't do a new study on Catalonia, I have to admit. But I think there is a question, is that something that still is relevant, and are we addressing this? So there are a couple of things that we've learned if we want to have a successful competitiveness upgrading strategy. First, there's no silver bullet. Clusters is no silver bullet. All the thinkers and people, academics that come here and tell you, here's the one solution, be very skeptical. The economy is too complex. Many things matter. And really, competitiveness upgrading is not about the one big thing. Very seldomly it is. Sometimes it is, but very seldomly it is. It is to align all these things in a way that really is most important for you. That's the magic sauce. The magic sauce is not creating another risk capital fund. It's kind of aligning all these small different things. And for that, every location needs to come up with its own plan. Economics is the same for all locations. But how this plays out is different in Catalonia from any other place in the world. And so benchmarking and learning from others only gets you so far. At the end, it's a decision that you need to take. And the decision that you need to take is kind of a social thing. You are part of that mechanism as cluster initiative managers. You need to prioritize, sequence, what's important now, who does what. And then you get the collective action that kind of makes a location more successful. More slides. So one, what are some of the things that this that it might be helpful, in my view, for you to think about as cluster initiative managers. As the clusters are changing, as we discussed, and also as policies changing, as we just discussed. So first, you are a change agent. And this whole role about technology foresight, understanding what's going on in other locations, market intelligence, I think is enormously important. And this is not something that companies on their own really can do quite as well. Yes, in the narrow fields where they compete with their products and services. But the broader systemic changes, I think there is an important role for you to play where you can really serve the interests of your companies very effectively. Second one of my colleagues talks a lot about cluster initiatives as bridge builders, and I think that's true, but I think you're much more than that. And you need to be much more than that. A bridge builder is somebody that just provides a service and listens to what government tells you and what firms tells you to do. I think good cluster managers are also challenging. You want to force companies to review their business models and their approaches constantly. Obviously, it's their decision. But I think you have the opportunity to stay back one step from that daily reality, and then you can be helpful. The same with government. Government might not see the reality of the companies in the marketplace the same way as you, and I think there's an obligation to feed that back. Third point, don't see cluster policy and good cluster policy as your enemy or as a control, but I would say it more the other way around. You have a stake in making sure that Catalonia has the best cluster policy possible. Then you can be successful in your work. In too many places, we don't see the dialogue this way. But I think you can actually help to make these programs much better. The need for a political antenna. I think one has to recognize that what we do here, cluster efforts, are in the political space. That's why this whole stuff about societal challenges comes up and is being put on your table. So people need to understand that that's what you need to do. And then finally, for your capabilities, it is a moving target, because we're asking cluster organizations to do new things time and time again. I think we also need to think always about how do we need to evolve the skill set and the certain capabilities that you have. Finally, for policymakers in Catalonia. So I do think we can do more here to integrate what you already do well into a broader regional economic strategy. I think there's potential here. Value proposition is something that I'm not seeing as clearly for Catalonia, but more needs to be done. Using clusters more systematically in your strategy, I think there is potential to do so. And finally, and I can say that because I'm not going to get the funding, but I think it is important that we align, let's see, our expectations from the cluster policy with the input and the support that we provide. There has to be a balance between these two things, and we can't only talk about how nice it is to have good clusters in Catalonia. We also need to kind of structure ourselves in that way. With that, let me close. Thank you.